The UCF Golden Knights in their first year of Division 1A play were just alright. Their offense, led by sophomore Dante Culpepper, would do just enough to keep the Knights in most games. Yet with an injury to Culpepper midway through the season and a general lack of a solid ground game, Central Florida would only average 25 points per game, good for 55th best in the nation. The defense was just as middle of the road, holding opponents to an average of 23.7 points per game. Also, funnily enough, good for 55th best in the nation. Hidden in this forgettable season, though, are two hints of what would come for these Knights. The first was a late October game against Georgia Tech. Like many mid-major programs in the South, Central Florida would make a habit of scheduling big-time Southern brands to fill out their schedule, having played South Carolina earlier in the year. The South Carolina game was a blowout, but in Atlanta, the Knights would make it close, staying within breathing distance of Tech for the vast majority of the game, and being one missed onside kick away from possibly spoiling the Yellow Jackets' homecoming. While they'd ultimately lose the game, they'd win plenty of respect from those in attendance, including, according to Culpepper, Georgia Tech's third-year head coach, George O'Leary. The other game was played 2 weeks later, against the UAB Blazers. The Blazers and Golden Knights both entered Division 1A at the same time, scheduling a game against one another in their debut seasons. These two programs will end up playing each other a fair amount going into the 2000s, but this first game is by far the most important. UCF, since its founding, has made it apparent that it strives to be more than a mid-major. Simply getting to Division 1 was never the goal, and the first step towards that dream of a Floridian Four was to beat their newly promoted siblings in Birmingham. Central Florida would win 35-13. A special thank you to my patrons for helping make this video happen. Central Florida's second ever Division 1A schedule was a gauntlet, complete with 5 different Power 5 teams and a collection of bad to great mid-majors. Thankfully for the Knights, though, it was also the first elite season of Dante Culpepper. By the end of the year, Culpepper would finish with the 8th most completions in the nation, the 8th best completion percentage, tied for 9th in touchdowns, and 14th in passer rating, right above Pittsburgh's Pete Gonzalez and right below some guy named Peyton Manning. By the end of the year, Culpepper, alongside the rest of the Knights' offense, would finish as the 10th best scoring offense in the nation, something that served to mortify their Power 5 slate. Their first game against Ole Miss, a game they were by no means supposed to be competitive in, was a perfect demonstration of what this squad was capable of. It'd be an unexpected dogfight, with the Knights tying their SEC opponent 17-17 going into their very first overtime game, finally falling on a missed 2-point conversion. Then came South Carolina, a team they were rinsed by the previous year, and again, in a supposed free win for the Gamecocks, UCF would go toe-to-toe with their SEC opponent, losing a 2-point game late on a failed onside kick. After their 2 SEC almost upsets came their first game of the year outside of the South. It would not get easier. The Nebraska Cornhuskers, employing All-American running back Amon Green and quarterback Scott Frost in offense, and a defense filled with future Pro Bowlers such as Mike Brown, Kyle Bosch, and Mike Rucker, all led by one of the greatest head coaches in college football history, taking on the plucky Knights in Lincoln. Ole Miss and South Carolina were middle-of-the-pack SEC teams, while Nebraska is a legitimate national title contender. which made what Central Florida would do next all the more impressive. With a minute and 16 seconds left in the first quarter, UCF would take a 7-0 lead in Lincoln. Then, by the end of the second, the Knights would find themselves up 17-14 against Goliath. Of course, Nebraska would wake up in the third, dropping 17 unanswered points on course for a 38-24 win. But this 17-14 score meant everything to this young program. Orlando was ecstatic, even after the loss, only lamenting the difficulty they'd have in scheduling Power 5 teams in the future. Hopes could not be higher for the Knights, meaning it was the perfect time for a foundation-shaking scandal. In late October 1997, the Secret Service would raid the UCF locker room on the hunt for telephones. The search was aimed at seizing a number of tampered phones used to make free calls, bypassing AT&T's billing system, with a number of these fraudulent numbers apparently being used during their trip to Nebraska. Among the 12 players implicated were starting wide receiver Todd Cleveland, starting offensive lineman Cornell Green, and the team's top scorer, tailback Mike Grant. A significant portion of the Knights' offense. Worse still, it would come out later that head coach Gene McDowell, the guiding hand of this program since their near closure in the mid-80s, would tip off the team shortly before the investigation. 1997 would be his final year in Orlando, and his final year as a head coach in general. McDowell's offensive coordinator, Mike Krzyzek, would assume his position shortly after the 97 season, and with much of the previous year's offense coming back, UCF was prepared to send a senior Culpepper out with a bang. In 1998, the Knights would dominate their schedule, ending the year with the nation's 8th best scoring offense at 35.7 points per game, an average propped up by returning tailback Mike Grant, and an absurd final year of Dante Culpepper. Top 10 in the nation in every meaningful QB stat, including a 5th-placed finish in completions, 1st in completion percentage, and 3rd in QB rating. Keep in mind the quarterback class he's being compared to in 1998. This is the same year of Donovan McNabb, Tim Couch, Major Applewhite, Chad Pennington, Drew Brees, Tom Brady. All the stats on par or worse than Central Florida's phenom under center. Now, granted, the quality of opponents is being left out here, but as his performance in 97 showed, he could indeed perform against the nation's best. He was a quarterback that more than belonged in this elite class of field generals, proven by his 6th-place finish in the 1998 Heisman race. Alongside one of the nation's best offenses, the Knights, for the first time as an FBS program, would also field a quality defense, finishing 31st in opponents' points per game at 19. They'd finished 9-2, albeit with a much easier, primarily mid-major schedule, and looked to be on the verge of making their first postseason appearance in the Wahoo Bowl. If not for a really stupid series of events involving the Miami Hurricanes. At the end of the 1998 season, the UCF Knights would accept a conditional invitation to the Oahu Bowl against the 11-1 Air Force Falcons. The condition? Well, the Pac-10 has a contract with both the Oahu and Aloha Bowls, which normally would kick the independent UCF out of the running. UCLA, however, is on track to make the BCS National Championship, with a thus far undefeated 10-0 record. If they finish undefeated, the Bruins will go to the Fiesta Bowl, and since the Pac-10's 2 other bowl-eligible teams will be playing in the Rose and Aloha Bowls, the Oahu Bowl is left wide open for the Golden Knights. All that stands in the way is UCLA's last game of the season against the Miami Hurricanes. Miami would win 49-45. UCLA would then get placed in the Rose Bowl, getting jumped by Florida State for the right to play in the Fiesta Bowl. Oregon would take the Aloha Bowl, and a 6-5 Washington would steal away Central Florida's first bowl game. Culpepper would go on to become UCF's first-round pick in the ensuing draft, going 11th overall to the Minnesota Vikings, with much of their 1998 squad leaving with him. The Knights would then fall back to earth the next season, experiencing one hell of a post-Culpepper stress test on September 11th, 1999, and their second game against Florida's Big Three. The feeling in Orlando surrounding the Knights' first game against the Florida Gators would differ quite a bit from their first game against the Seminoles. While Florida State and UCF had closer ties in regard to the football program itself, offering funds and equipment for the young program alongside having plenty of coaching overlap, Florida would be closer to the Knights in fan base and student body. Orlando is traditionally considered to be within Gator country, and many UCF students have friends and family that attend the University of Florida, and vice versa. To many, especially in Orlando, this game marked the beginning of a larger conflict of influence between these two fan bases, the battle of Central Florida's past and future. In this game, the future would remain out of reach. The offense would try to make it respectable, putting 27 onto a Gator defense and hold opponents to an average of 18 points per game. But there simply aren't many games you can win giving up 58 points. In every single season UCF has played in the FBS going into the year 2000, they've had at least one single score loss to a Power 5 team. In 96 it was Georgia Tech. In 97, it was Ole Miss, South Carolina, and Mississippi State. In 98, it was Auburn. In 99, it was Georgia. And sure enough, to kick off the 2000 season, UCF would lose another one-score game to George O'Leary's Georgia Tech. Each and every one a hallmark win that never materialized, a gallery of moral victories. How long would it take for the ball to finally bounce in the Knights' favor? Alabama, after winning the SEC in 1999, is having a historically bad season. In the midst of an NCAA investigation into recruiting violations, led by a coach who all but gave up after a Week 3 upset loss to Southern Mississippi, the Crimson Tide are going into their homecoming game with a 3-4 record, hoping a quick and easy cupcake win at home would help them, at the very least, finish out their schedule strong. Their cupcake would be the Central Florida Golden Knights, hungry to finally topple their first Power 5 team. A battered Alabama would soon find themselves in a shootout with UCF, going up 38-37 late, where Central Florida finally broke through. After 5 years of trying, UCF finally had their marquee win. Orlando was ecstatic, and Krzyzek could only compare it to the 2 Super Bowl rings he won in Pittsburgh. They'd finished the year 7-4, and to this day, the Central Florida Knights are still undefeated against the Crimson Tide. Since their founding in 1979, UCF has competed as an independent. It's this lack of conference affiliation that has given Central Florida the opportunity to schedule big-time programs above their pedigree to drum up intrigue, helping propel them from Division III to where they are now in Division 1A. However, being an independent comes with a fair amount of drawbacks. A lack of scheduling consistency, a lack of funds that otherwise come from a conference's media rights, and as shown in the 1998 Oahu Bowl fiasco, a lack of bowl guarantees. It's these drawbacks that lead to UCF, after 23 years, finally joining their very first conference, the Mid-American Conference. Now, from the outside looking in, it seems absurd. A mid-major conference located entirely in the upper Midwest, whose largest outlier before the Knights was Marshall and Buffalo, suddenly reaching all the way down to Florida. But under the surface, it makes a little bit more sense. UCF, since its promotion in '96, has played far more MAC teams than any other mid-major conference, meaning there's already at least some level of familiarity between the MAC and the Knights. The MAC also had everything UCF wanted: a media deal with ESPN, rights to the GMAC and Motor City Bowls, and an open spot in the conference, while UCF brought access to Floridian recruiting grounds to the MAC and its teams, as well as the growing Orlando media market. It was a sensible, albeit odd match, and with UCF going 7-4 their first year in their new conference, the Knights' future in the MAC seemed bright. And then they went 3-9, Krzyzek got fired, and they left the Mid-American. After going 3-7, despite landing a contract extension worth around $185,000, Mike Krzyzewski would be fired after 19 years of service to the Knights. The primary decider was off-the-field drama. Academics among players had slipped. Players were forging professors' signatures, and a cornerback was arrested for bringing a firearm on campus. Control was slipping, far more than the administration could accept, and the plug was pulled, with the university agreeing to pay his extension out. During this debacle, UCF would officially be invited to Conference USA, a conference that offered about the same benefits as the MAC did, with the benefit of closer conference members, easing travel costs. They'd accept the offer, moving alongside conference mate Marshall. They'd spend one more season in the Mid-American, helmed by their brand new head coach, former Yellow Jacket George O'Leary. Despite the new coach, the tribulations would not end, with UCF going winless for the first time since 1982. It was far from a surprise, though. The program had been through hell, and O'Leary needed time to right the ship and get his team to their new conference in one piece. 2005 was a much-needed turnaround for the program. They'd go 8-5, make their first conference championship as a program, before making their first bowl as a program, being 1 point short of knocking off Nevada in the Hawaii Bowl. Aside from O'Leary's impressive turnaround of the program, though, another important event in the history of these Knights would occur. For the first time since Bethune-Cookman, UCF had a rival. When Central Florida joined Division I-A in 1996, they arrived as the only mid-major within the state of Florida. Soon to arrive after was FAU, Howard Schnellenberger's personal Boca Raton pet project, followed by their crosstown rivals in FIU, neither of which were to be UCF's match. Instead, their new rival would come from Tampa. USF, in almost every single measurable, existed in the early to mid-2000s as UCF's much more successful younger sibling. Being founded in 1997, they'd begin their journey through college football in Division I-AA, a place that took UCF 11 years to reach. They'd spend 4 years in the FCS before being promoted to the FBS. UCF took 6. And while Central Florida took 6 years to get their first Power 5 upset, the South Florida Bulls did it in 2 games, beating an eventual 7-5 Pittsburgh 35-26 in Heinz Field to claim their first win as an FBS program. Then, to make matters worse, USF would surpass their Orlando brethren, and, soon after their founding, leave the mid-majors altogether. The Miami Hurricanes would leave the Big East in 2003, leaving a giant hole in its wake. And with Boston College following the U to the ACC, the conference would be left scrambling to find programs to replace them with. Traditional mid-major overachievers Cincinnati and Louisville would be invited, but the loss of the Floridian market needed to be addressed. There were practically only 2 options to fill the Hurricanes' void. One option was a successful program proven to be consistently competitive at a Power 5 level, with a solid football facility and basketball stadium to boot, and the other was reeling from a winless season in the Mid-American Conference. The decision was obvious. This immediate success would naturally breed arrogance going into their first matchup in Tampa, and unfortunately for the Knights, that arrogance would be backed up by a dominant 31-14 bowl victory. Just like their old rivalry with the Wildcats, the second war on the I-4 would begin with Central Florida being far and away outclassed. Not to say they wouldn't soon catch up. What 3 running backs hold the record for the 3 most rushing yards in the season? If you guessed Barry Sanders for the top spot, you'd be correct, having rushed for a record 2,628 yards for Oklahoma State in 1988. Now, who are the 2 backs after him? Well, second is Wisconsin's Melvin Gordon, finishing with 2,587 rushing yards in 2014. And the third would be UCF's own Kevin Smith. Central Florida's junior running back would finish 2007 with the 3rd most single-season rushing yards in the history of college football, finishing just under Gordon with 2,567 yards, averaging 5.7 yards a carry. Smith wouldn't just feast on Conference USA competition either. In the UCF season opener against North Carolina State, he'd put up 217 yards, an average of 2.6 yards a carry, and 2 touchdowns on the Wolfpack en route to a 25-23 Knight victory. The week after came a trip to Austin to take on the number 5 Texas Longhorns. And again, Smith would put up numbers against one of the nation's best ground defenses, finishing the day with 149 yards, 5.5 yards per carry, and 2 more touchdowns to bring his team within 1 onside kick of knocking off the Longhorns. And of course, these displays of dominance from UCF would be overshadowed by what was going on in Tampa. Through wins over Auburn, North Carolina, and a top 5 West Virginia, USF would attain a number 2 ranking in the AP poll. A program that barely even existed a decade ago, one only 3 years into the Power 6, is a genuine national title contender. A claim bolstered by their 64-12 shelling of Kevin Smith and the UCF Knights on their home turf. As a minor consolation though, these 2 teams' fortunes would flip shortly after this game. UCF would go undefeated after their beatdown in Tampa, making their second Conference USA Championship game and winning it for the first time in dominant fashion against Tulsa. USF, meanwhile, would shit the bed immediately after their number 2 ranking, losing to Rutgers and finishing the year unranked. Kevin Smith, despite being completely overlooked in Doak Walker voting, would finish 8th in Heisman voting, just above LSU defensive lineman Glenn Dorsey and below Boston College quarterback and Atlanta Falcon great Matt Ryan. The Central Florida program was in a spot it hadn't been since the late 90s, finishing with double-digit wins for the first time in program history. Better yet, 2007 would mark its first year away from the old Citrus Bowl. While it had served the program well throughout its history, it was already an outdated liability the second UCF began using it as their home stadium, and it's only gotten worse over the years. This, alongside its distance from Central Florida's campus, would push the Knights into building a stadium of their own, finally breaking ground on FBC Mortgage Stadium in 2006, where they've played their home games ever since. Its nickname is the, quote, bounce house, called that due to its tendency to shake when fans jump in unison. The shaking, surprisingly, has never put any actual stress on the stadium's structural integrity, giving the venue a safe and unique, possibly nauseating, edge. The future seemed brighter than ever in Orlando, which made what would happen even worse. On March 18th of 2008, redshirt freshman Eric Plancher would collapse during practice, being rushed to emergency care shortly after, where, a little over an hour later, he was pronounced dead. What happened that March 18th morning would be heavily disputed, with 2 conflicting stories being formed regarding the tragedy. First was George O'Leary's and his staff's assessment of the situation. Plancher had struggled during practice, but not enough to warrant any concern. He's better than that, O'Leary would claim to say to the people around him. He'd finish out the day, and the next thing O'Leary knew, he was unresponsive. The players in attendance would give another retelling of events. Most players interviewed attested that something wasn't right with Plancher. His eyes were dark, he couldn't catch his breath. Shortly before the end of practice, he would fall to the ground during sprints. "That's a bunch of bullshit out of you, son," players would claim O'Leary said to the clearly struggling redshirt freshman. He could not respond, and shortly after, he would collapse. Eric Plancher suffered from a blood condition known as sickle cell trait, or SCT, which put the player at risk for health complications, especially after high-intensity workouts. UCF, at least according to an ESPN report, was both aware of Plancher's condition and the possible effects SCT has on athletes. A wrongful death lawsuit would soon be filed by the Plancher family, and despite a jury siding with the family, the Florida Supreme Court would unanimously back the university, claiming sovereign immunity. Mourning the loss of Eric Plancher would be his cousin, Moisey Plancher, who happened to play running back across the I-4, set to start against his cousin's former team in the 2008 season. The 2008 UCF-USF game would, seemingly, end up being the last game of the short-lived rivalry. Central Florida would make it a game, fighting all the way into overtime, but the Bulls would end up on top, winning their 4th straight game against the Knights. They brought a golden shovel with them to Raymond James Stadium for the occasion, proceeding to bury the Knights. Central Florida would get back at them a little bit, leaking starting quarterback Matt Gross' number before the game, But the message from Tampa was as clear as day. USF would cancel the series going forward, locking down a 4-year deal to play the Miami Hurricanes instead. To USF, Central Florida did not, and has never, deserved to share the field with them. Speaking of Miami, a few weeks after the final battle on the I-4, UCF would play their first game against the last of Florida's Big Three, the Miami Hurricanes. Miami would by far have the furthest relationship with the Knights, having neither the administrative closeness of Florida State nor the geographic proximity to Florida, instead having their own group of local mid-majors to bicker and build relationships with. Despite this, there was still Miami's indirect meddling with the Knights over the years, the '98 Oahu Bowl and their departure from the Big East coming to mind. It would be the perfect way to put the horrors of the previous offseason in the rearview, alongside proving they were indeed on the same footing with the Bulls, to finally pick up that historic win over one of Florida's golden children. They'd get close, putting up a defensive effort that was more than Miami's match, but unfortunately, the offense would languish as it would all season, and the Knights would be left with an agonizing 14-20 loss. Then, as the Knights entered the 2010s, came more bad news. Throughout the late 2000s and early 2010s, the Central Florida Athletic Department would be investigated by the NCAA for recruiting violations. Specifically, a, quote, athletics representative had given football and basketball prospects tens of thousands of dollars under the table as incentive to play in Orlando. This would come immediately after UCF self-reported a number of, quote, impermissible recruiting calls conducted from 2007 to 2009. These findings would result in a brief postseason ban and 5 years of probation, but they would not lead to the dismissal of George O'Leary, as the NCAA found zero evidence that he was involved. In the end, that would end up being incredible news for the Knights. From the middle of tragedy, heart-wrenching losses, and NCAA discipline, came some of the best football the program had ever played. First came 2009, with the Knights rebounding from 2008 with an 8-5 record and a convincing win over Case Keenum's Houston Cougars. Then came 2010, achieving a program-best 11 wins, their second Conference USA title, and a win in the Liberty Bowl, taking down the Georgia Bulldogs to secure their second win over an SEC opponent. The Knights of this era were built upon the back of their defense, and no season was this dominance illustrated better than in 2011. Now, 2011 was a strange year for the Knights. It would begin with a 30-3 domination of Boston College, followed by an unfortunate series of 6 one-score losses that culminate in a 5-7 season. To blame was a young, middling offense, but what kept them competitive in all of those games was their defense, who were top 10 in the nation in opponents' points per game, plays per game, and combined yards per game. In terms of wearing opposing offenses down, these Knights were some of the nation's best, at least within the mid-majors. And then the following year, despite NCAA sanctions, the Knights would see a return to form, winning 10 games. In the midst of these 3 seasons of success was good news, and for once, it would come from the Big East. The conference was falling apart, and with the last of their big names jumping ship throughout 2012 and 2013 to various Power 5 conferences, their position as a major conference became untenable. Now looking to sit pretty among the new group of 5, the Big East would reach out to the highest valued mid-majors to recruit for their new-look conference. Central Florida, with its recent success and valuable Orlando media market, was an obvious choice, joining alongside conference mates Memphis, SMU, and Houston, and former Big East castaway Temple. There waiting for the Knights, in the newly rebranded American Athletic Conference, were the Bulls. Despite their relative success since joining the old Big East, they would lose out to Louisville in getting the final lifeboat out of the sinking conference. They were stuck with the program they buried a mere 5 years ago, and when the war on the I-4 inevitably began again in 2013, the Knights were more than prepared. The Bulls would meet a team in Orlando that was unrecognizable from the program they walloped upon in the 2000s. The defense that bullied Conference USA the past few years were in great form, but unlike those previous years, they'd have one hell of an offense to match. Under junior quarterback Blake Bortles, the Knights would start off the season strong, defeating Penn State and Happy Valley before coming within a single score of knocking off an eventual top 5 South Carolina. Shortly after came another test against the Louisville Cardinals. Ranked number 8 in the AP poll and helmed by quarterback Teddy Bridgewater, the Cardinals were by far the favorites to win the American, until their game against UCF. The entire game would consist of a duel between two of the Group of Five's best field generals, eventually coming down to the final moments of the fourth quarter, where, after a number of dramatic plays, Central Florida would gain its first win over a top 10 opponent in program history. It would also put them in the driver's seat to win the AAC, running the table going into their 5th matchup against the South Florida Bulls. USF, on the other hand, was 2-8 under first-year head coach Willie Taggart. A bowl has long been off the table, an AAC title even more so. But if by some miracle the Bulls can maintain their undefeated record against their cross-state rivals, it'd be all worth it. They'd keep it shockingly close, but like the Knights in 2008, it'd simply not be enough. For the first time in program history, UCF had beaten the South Florida Bulls, and 1 week later they would claim the very first AAC conference title, and their first bid in a BCS Bowl. The list of BCS busters is short and illustrious, only consisting of the greatest the mid-majors have to offer, and on January 1st of 2014, UCF would join that prestigious club, facing off against the 6th-ranked Baylor Bears in the Fiesta Bowl. Boasting the nation's highest-scoring offense at an absurd 52.4 points per game, the question regarding Central Florida's first major bowl game was whether or not they could even keep up. And after a monster second half from Bortles, they'd do more than simply keep up. By the end of it, the UCF Knights would come out victorious in the Fiesta Bowl, claiming their first top 10 finish in the AP poll, and the place in the minds of fans, recruits, and coaches nationwide. A beacon emanating from Orlando, Florida, one that signaled the simple fact that the Knights belonged. The fall-off in the following 2 years would be immense, going a respectable 9-4 in 2014 before going completely winless in 2015. How? Well, George O'Leary, after being part of these Knights since their promotion back in 1996 as either an opponent or a coach, would plan his retirement across the 2015 season. In the meantime, he'd also act as the university's interim athletic director, which in UCF football's entire history has worked out exactly once. On October 25th of 2015, O'Leary would resign from both roles, entering retirement after a 47-year-long coaching career. For his replacement, UCF would look back to the 90s and find yet another familiar face on an opposing sideline. Scott Frost, from 2009 to 2015, would help construct the offensive juggernaut that was the early 2010s Oregon Ducks. First as a wide receivers coach and later as both offensive coordinator and QB coach for Marcus Mariota. He's looking for his first head coaching job, and seeing the potential UCF has, chose Orlando, settling in with a 6-7 record in 2016, a far cry from 0-12. UCF's first few years in the AAC would see the foundations be laid for the birth and rebirth of a number of rivalries. There's, of course, the renewed war on the I-4, now more competitive than ever, but there were also a couple of teams up north, beginning with the Cincinnati Bearcats. A member of the old Big East joining alongside South Florida in 2005, the Bearcats would emerge in the late 2000s and early 2010s as a perennial conference contender in the last years of the conference, making back-to-back BCS Bowls in 2008 and 2009 under head coach Brian Kelly before winning the conference 2 more times in 2011 and 2012 under Butch Jones. As of 2016, they'd play the Knights twice. Yet as both programs began their ascent to the top of the American Athletic Conference in the late 2010s, the rivalry would only heat up. And then, there's UConn. In George O'Leary's last full season as Central Florida's head coach in 2014, his Knights would lose a single conference game en route to their second straight AAC title against the Connecticut Huskies. In the midst of a deep rebuild under Bob Diaco, the Knights would conversely be UConn's single conference win, the sole highlight of an eventual 2-10 season. In order to put this highlight on a pedestal, Diaco would go on to talk to the local press to kind of float the idea of a rivalry. The civil conflict, a battle between the AAC's northernmost and southernmost programs, complete with a trophy and a clock ticking down to their next game. The only problem was UCF didn't care. O'Leary, when asked about the quote-unquote rivalry, would respond in confusion, especially when the trophy for this alleged rivalry was brought up. Now, I don't think I need to go too far in depth to talk about how the civil conflict was never going to work, but I will anyways, just because I love this story, personally. College rivalries are rarely born between two teams across the nation, but it's far from unheard of. The issue is these rivalries are usually born either due to frequent postseason play, i.e. Penn State, Alabama, or Miami, Nebraska, or historical ties, Miami, Virginia Tech, Notre Dame, USC. This game had neither. UCF and UConn's first game was in 2013, and while Central Florida was on an upward trajectory during much of the 2010s, UConn was plummeting, making a single bowl game during their time in the American. It was very clearly a Bob Diaco publicity stunt, one UCF did not care to reciprocate. In 2016, in Scott Frost's first game against the Huskies, the Civil Conflict Trophy would be wheeled out to Rentschler Field, set to go home with the winner. The Knights would end up leaving East Hartford with a 24-16 win. Just a 24-16 win, leaving the trophy behind where it'd be lost to this very day, bringing UCF's count of obscure rivalry trophies made for publicity lost during games to 2. Somehow. Bob Diaco would be fired after the 2016 season, and the civil conflict would, unfortunately, go with him. After a 6-7 season to get the program back on its feet, the hope going into 2017 was marginal improvement, that the offense would begin to finally resemble the offenses Scott Frost had in Oregon, and a young defense wouldn't regress enough to be a liability. The Knights wouldn't get that. They'd instead be met with the greatest Central Florida team by far in program history. They'd begin the year with 5 straight games won by a minimum of 27 points, including a 38-10 blowout of the Maryland Terrapins. The Knights would end the season with one of the best offenses in the nation, being 5th in yards per game, 2nd in yards per play, and number 1 in the nation in points per game. Through the arm of sophomore quarterback Mackenzie Milton, who would finish 8th in Heisman voting, and the hands of receivers Traquan Smith, Dredrick Snelson, and Jordan Atkins, blowouts would become the norm across their 2017 slate. In the rare cases a game would come down to the wire, though, UCF could lean on one of the nation's best big play defenses. The defense would actually end up taking a step back from the previous year in terms of opponents' points per game and yards per game, but they'd more than make up for it with a monstrous 2.5 takeaways a game. Central Florida would soon find themselves 10-0, but the true test for these Knights would be in their final 3 games, beginning with the first-ranked battle on the I-4. South Florida, fully recovered from their early 2010s woes under Charlie Strong, went into Orlando with a 9-1 record and a 22nd rank in the AP poll, mostly through the efforts of dual-threat powerhouse Quentin Flowers. UCF would shell-shock the Bulls early with a dominant 21-7 lead going into the second quarter, but USF would not cave, having a 13-0 second quarter to cut the Knights' lead to a measly 1 point going into halftime. Then, the Bulls would take their first lead, going up 36-28 with 1 quarter left to play. With the game on the line, the Central Florida offense would roar back to life. In the blink of an eye, the game would be tied at 42, with only a couple minutes left on the clock. Then came a 95-yard dash to the end zone to win the 2017 war on the I-4. Well, that and a South Florida fumble to seal the game away. With Alabama and Miami losing that day, UCF became only one of 2 undefeated teams left. Next was the AAC Championship game against the 16th ranked Memphis Tigers led by second-year head coach Mike Norvell. Since suffering a blowout loss to the Knights earlier in the year, they've completely run the board, boasting the nation's second-best scoring offense in the process. The stage was set for one of the best shootouts of the 2010s, with Milton and Co. and the Tigers' Riley Ferguson and Tony Pollard trading quarters of dominance all the way into overtime, finishing the fourth quarter tied at 48, to then finish first overtime tied at 55, before Central Florida, in second overtime, got their 12th straight win. With Wisconsin losing that day in the Big Ten Championship, UCF became the final undefeated team in Division 1A college football. Going into bowl season undefeated for the first time in program history, they'd be set to face off against the 7th-ranked Auburn Tigers in their second New Year's Six Bowl as a program, the 2018 Peach Bowl. Auburn, a team barely missing out on the playoffs while stealing wins from the playoff-bound Crimson Tide and Bulldogs, would stand as the Knights' final test. While the Knights' offense got off to a cold start, the defense would step up and limit the Tigers to a mere field goal going into the second, where the UCF offense would finally take control, assuming a 13-6 lead going into halftime. While Auburn would attempt to regain control of the game in the third, the Knights would close out with a 14-7 fourth quarter to put the game away, sealed with a Jared Stidham interception in the end zone. UCF was 13-0, the only undefeated team in the nation, and now, when evaluating UCF's claim, it's worth keeping in mind this whole thing is a publicity stunt. One that worked wonders considering it's still being talked about going on 7 years after. National titles are determined by voters and historically have often been split, even in the BCS era. But nowadays, most major voters recognize whoever wins the BCS or playoff national title game. The human voters, at least. The Colley Matrix is one of a handful of major computer voters, using an algorithm instead of human voters to determine team quality. 2017 would not be the first time the Colley Matrix disagreed with the outcomes of national title games, crowning Alabama the previous year despite losing to Clemson, Notre Dame in 2012 despite being demolished by the Crimson Tide, and Oklahoma State the year before that. The reason most of these teams do not claim these titles is the simple fact that they had the opportunity to win it all in the title game and lost. Central Florida, on the other hand, was snubbed from any playoff consideration, being ranked number 12 at the end of the regular season in the college football playoff poll, despite going undefeated. The question then isn't whether or not UCF's 2017 national title holds any merit, it's if the Knights were truly snubbed out of the playoffs. Meet the formula. Trademark still pending. A recurring, almost objective equation I've made and used in multiple videos to determine team quality. 2017 UCF, when their season-long stats are run through the formula, end up with a final score of 1,103.2, mostly on the backs of their high-flying offense and ball-hawk defense, held back by their weaker Group of 5 schedule. Does this score match up with the year's playoff teams? Well, beginning with the widely recognized 2017 national champions, Alabama would score a whopping 1,669.11, far and away the best score 2017 had to offer. But what about the rest of the field? Beginning with the national title runner-ups, the Georgia Bulldogs would get into the playoffs with by far the toughest schedule out of the 4 title contenders, overcoming their schedule through a dominant rushing game and tough defense to make it to the title game against Alabama. The style of play, though, does not lend itself to statistical anomalies, specializing in just grinding down opponents and getting the job done, leading to 2017 Georgia finishing with a score of 864.08. Then comes the third seed, the 2017 Oklahoma Sooners, having the best offensive score in the sample by a wide margin through the play of Heisman quarterback Baker Mayfield. The Sooners would have a final score of 1,102, 1.2 points lower than the Knights, mostly due to Oklahoma's relatively weak Big 12 schedule, and a Lincoln Riley defense. Finally, there's the number 1 seed, and according to the formula, the weakest team to make the playoffs, the 2017 Clemson Tigers, putting up more than solid numbers on both sides of the ball, more so on defense, yet neither side is elite enough at either to net them a score higher than 808.17. Now, I'll be the first to acknowledge that this formula values turnovers a bit much, something that unfairly deflates teams built like 2017 Georgia and inflates teams built like, 2017 UCF. But the fact that these scores, built upon tangible year-long stats mind you, puts the Knights right in the middle of these playoff teams indicate that they at least deserved more consideration than what they got. But being snubbed was honestly probably for the better. At the end of the day, getting snubbed from the playoffs got the Knights their undefeated season and their national title, which in the end would only help them differentiate themselves from just another BCS buster. In the middle of this whirlwind of a season was the beginning of one of the most interesting traditions in modern college football. Florida Technical University, the predecessor to UCF, was built initially to reinforce America's aerospace efforts in the 60s, an outer space origin seen in Central Florida's original mascot, the Citronaut. Since then, FTU and eventually UCF would diversify its courses and put its space-based origins in the rear view. Until October 14, 2017, where UCF played its first space game against ECU. Since 2017, UCF has held a space game every single year, with the special home game entailing, among other things, a frankly amazing looking space-themed jersey helmet combo, unique to each and every year. Since 2017, space games have included the likes of Oklahoma State, Houston, and Memphis, and as of 2023, they are undefeated in such games. After 2017, Scott Frost would leave for his alma mater, Nebraska, leaving his replacement, former Missouri offensive coordinator Josh Heupel, the keys to one of the most stacked group of 5 teams in the nation. What resulted was yet another undefeated regular season, dominating the AAC en route to their second straight conference title, and their second straight New Year's Six Bowl, an amazing season only dampened by the season-ending injury Mackenzie Milton would suffer during his game against the Bulls. For their bowl, the Knights would travel back to Arizona to play in their second Fiesta Bowl. Their opponents this time would be the LSU Tigers, helmed by a junior Joe Burrow, and fresh off their infamous 7th overtime game against Texas A&M. Unlike 2018's Peach Bowl, unfortunately, the Tigers would remain in the driver's seat for much of the game, eventually winning out 40-32, ending Central Florida's 25-game winning streak, tying for 19th longest in Division 1A history. The next few years would see the Knights cool off a bit from their 2 years of dominance, a cool-off that had coincided with Cincinnati's rise to the top of the American under Luke Fickell. Even in this drop-off, though, Central Florida would remain near the top of the group of 5, winning 10 games in 2019 and having a respectable 6-4 COVID-shortened 2020, before losing yet another head coach to the Power 5. To fill Heupel's shoes, in a return to UCF tradition, would be a familiar face from an opposing sideline. Gus Malzahn, taken away from a forced retirement following his firing from Auburn, would be thrust back into coaching in 2021, leading the program that had beaten him a mere 3 years ago in the Peach Bowl. The move for UCF made perfect sense though, bringing in yet another high-tempo offensive mind to maintain the success Heupel and Frost had, which Malzahn would largely do, going 8-4 in the regular season and clinching a berth in the Gasparilla Bowl, to take on a team they haven't played since 2006. The Florida Gators were in a freefall following the firing of Dan Mullen, barely making it to the postseason with a 24-21 win over Florida State. Despite this, Central Florida's team was young. Malzahn was still both getting settled into the job and recovering from a broken leg. Because of this, the Gators would still be favored going into the rare intrastate showdown. But if there were to be a chance for UCF to finally, after 26 years of trying, secure their first win over one of Florida's golden children, it would be now. They would not take the moment for granted. In front of the first sellout crowd in Gasparilla Bowl history, UCF would defeat the Florida Gators 29-17. The game, while neck and neck in the third, was hardly close, and most could see the writing on the wall. After this game, with a win over one of Florida's big three, multiple BCS Bowl invites, and an undefeated season under their belt, UCF's 42-year-long journey to the pinnacle of college football was almost over. All that was left was for Texas to trigger yet another massive conference realignment. When Texas and Oklahoma announced their departure from the Big 12 in the summer of 2021, the conference was left scrambling to avoid the fate of the old Big East, looking to very quickly backfill with the group of five's best, so the conference wouldn't fall apart. The programs chosen would be the independent BYU and AAC contenders Houston, Cincinnati, and the University of Central Florida. The state of Florida would once again have 4 Power 5 teams, or rather Power 4, as the Pac-12 would collapse shortly after, bolstering the Big 12's position with the addition of the Arizona schools, Utah and Colorado. The Knights would play their final season as a mid-major in 2022, where they'd wage, as of 2024, the final war on the I-4. This game would obviously harken back to the 2008 game, where the roles were reversed and the Bulls buried the hapless Knights. But it would also mirror the final battle of the original war on the I-4, the final game UCF played against Bethune-Cookman as an FCS program in 1995. It was a rivalry that quite literally saved the University of Central Florida's football program. And yet, as UCF began its journey beyond the FCS into Division 1A, they'd unceremoniously leave them behind. It remains to be seen whether USF will be able to catch up. And with the ACC's future in question, the opportunity to ride a wave of realignment back to a major conference, like they did in the mid-2000s, presents itself. I personally hope they do, lest they become the Knights' second Bethune-Cookman. The Knights' first year in the Power 4 went fine. They'd go 6-6 in the regular season, pulling off conference wins against Cincinnati, Houston, and of course, the number 15 Oklahoma State Cowboys in their annual space game, all before losing in the Gasparilla Bowl to a resurgent Georgia Tech. Looking forwards, the Knights seem set to make a solid leap forward in 2024, with a solid transfer and recruiting class helping to bolster their relatively young roster. There's still room for these Knights to grow. With the Big 12 as wide open as it is, the possibility of UCF winning a Big 12 title, and by extension their first playoff berth, doesn't seem terribly far-fetched. And while the Central Florida brand still lacks the cachet Florida's biggest brands have, if there's one takeaway from all of this history, it's that they'll get there, someday sooner rather than later. After all, Central Florida is the first and only team to ever see every single corner of college football, from playing on flooded Division III practice fields to struggling as a Division II program one bad loss away from shuttering, to emerging as an FCS contender, to their entire journey through the FBS. From Culpeper to Milton, from one burial to another, from Frost the quarterback to Frost the coach, and everything in between. Central Florida is the most interesting team to grace college football. One I hope to God loses in Week 6. I once again want to thank my patrons for helping make this video happen. Specifically, the Erupturatan, Adrian Genge, Deatheros, CC, The Hidden Source, Scarface 1, Lamb, Mega Doomer, Philip, Crosley Jones, Sean McWilliams, Bradley Moore, and Blake. If you want to support the channel and help decide upcoming videos, consider joining my Patreon, linked below. And lastly, thank you all for watching. It genuinely means the most.